Welcome to the Arrive podcast, the U.S. immigration law podcast for Canadians. I am Jeremy Richards, and I'm here with my business partner and fellow immigration attorney, Christine Jurusik. Together, we are Richards and Jurusik Immigration Law, practicing U.S. immigration law from our offices in Buffalo, New York, and Toronto, Ontario. And we help Canadians to work and live in the United States. If you haven't already, please follow and like us on your podcast app. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Richards and Jurusik Immigration Law, and follow us and like us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram for regular updates on U.S. immigration law that we have created just for Canadians. In addition, on our website, there is a resources tab where you can subscribe to a weekly newsletter where you will receive all our recent updates and posts about U.S. immigration law as well. On today's Arrive podcast, we're going to be discussing a question that has come up very frequently lately because of what's going on with not only with as COVID settled and that's kind of going by, but we're seeing the impact of that on the labor market and the impact on employers. In the IT field, recently you've seen a lot of layoffs. The big companies, the big tech companies, Facebook being one of them, Google another one, that have laid off masses of employees recently.
Meta. That's the
and
Twitter
company. Oh, Twitter.
Yeah, Elon Musk had a big layoff.
Twitter. Elon came in, I think it was the day he took over, fired his whole executive staff, and then laid off half the company. So these tech companies rely heavily on foreign employment, and a lot of them are Canadians that are in here in the United States working on non-immigrant visas. So they could be here on an L visa, an H-1 visa, a TN visa, an E visa, any number of non-immigrant visas working in the United States. So the question really is, what happens if you're here in the United States, you're here on a non-immigrant visa, on a work visa, and all of a sudden you lose your job? You get laid off, you get fired, or maybe you quit and you walked away from your position.
Yeah, because now it's not just your source of income that's gone; it's the source of staying in the United States that's gone as well.
Exactly, and I think that's the biggest issue people run into. They're not always as concerned about losing their job as they are about losing their ability to live in the U.S. They may have a house, a car, their kids are in school, all attached to the United States, and all of a sudden, they don't know what to do. I was here on this TN visa, I got fired, but how do I take care of this? I have my house I need to take care of, my belongings, whatever it is attached to your living in the United States. Most people, when they come here, they're living here. They've transitioned their life to the United States. And that means a lot of things that need to be tied up before they can depart the United States. And I think most people look for, what can I do to continue to stay here? I don't want to leave. I want to transition somehow to a visa status or something that's going to allow me to stay here in the United States, at least short term, to tie up all these loose ends, or hopefully long term where I don't have to leave at all.
Yeah, we get a lot of calls like that. You know, I was laid off or I lost my job and I don't have another job prospect on the horizon. I plan to go home to my home country, but how do I get an extra, 60, 90 days out of this so that I can tie up my lease and, find a sublet sometimes or, pack up my stuff and get out of here.
And most of the time this is unexpected, and that's why it happened.
Yeah,
right?
Sadly.
It was short. It happened way sooner than expected, and it wasn't planned for. And we watch closely what's happening with our website and why people are calling and visiting. And two of the top things that people are looking for right now are questions as to what they do if they lose their TN visa employment or the H-1B visa employment.
Right. And the first thing you have to know is that, if you're not familiar with this process, maybe it's your first time here on a visa, if you lose your employment, which is the source of your status here in the United States, even though you have a validity period left on your visa, that doesn't mean you're still validly here in the United States. So it's that employment that's anchoring you, not just your validity period.
Yes. So in order to maintain your visa, each visa has conditions attached to it. So a work visa, the condition that makes your work visa valid is that you are working on that visa for that employer in that profession in the United States. If you cease to work for that employer for any number of reasons, laying off, fired, quitting, then your visa status ends with that employment status. In other words, you're not maintaining your status anymore if you're not continuing to work. So
yeah, it's the same thing for students, right? So if you're here on a student visa and you stop going to school, you're not really eligible for a student visa anymore.
Your student visa can be revoked.
Right.
So there are a few grace periods that attach to visa statuses. And here we're talking about these employment visas, the TNs, the H-1Bs, the Ls of the world. And what are the grace periods that you have if this happens to you?
Yeah, the U.S. government isn't totally heartless. They don't kick you out. You don't
totally.
lose your job and then they kick you out the next day. You do get some time.
They do give you time. And on that, if you don't plan properly, they expect you to know these things, right? They expect you to know the grace periods, even though most people don't. They expect you to know the conditions of your visa. They expect you to know what you can and can't do, when you're supposed to leave, and what you can do on that visa. If you fail to understand what you can and can't do on your visa, or when you need to leave and what rules you need to abide by, guess whose problem that is? It's yours. And they don't care. If you violate the terms of your visa and you claim ignorance, guess what? That's not an excuse. It's your responsibility to understand what you can and can't do on your visa, or what you must do if you lose your job. So not understanding the rules of your visa can have long-term consequences, and there's no excuse for that. So the first thing I think we need to explain for you to hopefully understand what happens if you quit or lose your job and the grace periods that attach are your visa itself, or your status. Well, we refer to it as visa status. So if you came to the United States, and we'll use TN visa as our example because most of the Canadians we work with are on TN visas. When you come, let's say you went to the Peace Bridge and you were stamped for a TN visa status, they're going to put the date you were admitted. So let's say you were admitted November 1st, 2020. That's the start of your status. Once they stamp you and admit you on November 1st, 2020, you are now authorized to work and live in the United States until the end of your stamp.
They don't stamp you anymore, so
a frame of reference. When they admit you,
right,
they will put it into the system electronically.
In your I-94,
They'll electronically admit you. But
it's kind of like electronically stamping you.
I'm using old language. I'm old. So the stamp or the date they admit you, right? It's really your date you're admitted, right? November 1st, 2020. And let's say they approved you for 3 years. So it expires in 2023, October 31st, 2023. Is there 31 days in October? I hope so. Until October of 2023. You are allowed to work, live, go in and outside of the United States as much as you want during that 3-year time period, right? As long as you maintain the conditions of the employment. Well, if you're admitted for a TN visa to work for Kraft and you're producing mac and cheese for them as a food scientist.
Or as like we call it in Canada, Kraft dinner.
Kraft dinner.
That's right.
And you're a food scientist. Well, as long as you're working for Kraft as a food scientist, you can stay that entire 3-year time period. You need to plan what to do at the end of that 3 years, though. You need to have a plan in place because when it expires, we'll talk about that grace period first. When your visa expires, let's say you stayed your entire time period, so you're admitted November 1st, 2020, and October 31st, 2023 rolls around, and Kraft decides they're not extending your visa, well, you need to be prepared what to do. If that happens and you don't find a new employer, then you have a 10-day grace period. That's all you're allotted because the government expects you to have planned. You had 3 years when you were here. Mm-hmm. You had 3 years to plan for this eventual end of your employment, and they give you 10 days to depart the country. So, in that case, if your visa has expired, in other words, you are now to the date that you were admitted, the end date, you have a 10-day grace period to act.
From the end of that visa.
From the end of that visa, you had a 10-day grace period.
Assuming you worked right up until the end of the visa.
Assuming you maintained your work status until the end. 10 days. That's all you get. Well, why? Some people say, why? Why only 10 days? Well, because you had 3 years and 10 days if you think about it. You should be planning for your departure the day you get your visa. You should be planning from day one on your visa what you're going to do 3 years from now. Whether that is extending that visa, finding a new employer, or leaving the country, those plans should be in place. Procrastination is the enemy for immigration. If you procrastinate, you're going to get yourself into trouble. We typically advise people to plan at least 6 months out. At least 6 months.
Yeah.
Because you can file for
That's
most
a good
of
time.
these extensions 6 months before it expires. If you wanted to, you could file by mail to extend that visa. So it's taken care of before it expires. So if you're giving yourself at least 6 months, you can take care of a lot of these things. You could sell a car. You could sell a house. You could, transition your kids to another school.
Find a new
whatever.
employer.
Find a new employer.
Yeah.
So if your employer is giving you signals that they're not going to extend that visa at the end of 3 years, or it's not moving forward, start shopping for a new job so that when it does end, you have a plan in place. Or if you don't find one,
just keep in mind you've only got 10 days after your visa ends to pack it up and get out. And that doesn't mean, so that's, that's a hard line cutoff, 10 days. But we've had plenty of people call us at the 10-day mark and say, what should I do? And we say, you should leave the country. And if you haven't tied up your loose ends, you can always ask a border officer if you're allowed back in as a visitor, because Canadians can come in as a visitor for up to 6 months. So they may admit you maybe for 6 months, you never know, or they may admit you for a few weeks, whatever time you need to come in and wrap up your loose ends. I've had plenty of people ask for that.
In the hands of the
right.
officer,
It's discretionary. They don't have to, but usually the officers understand that it can take more than 10 days. So, but you do need to leave the country in order to reset your status.
And there's generally 3 things you can do once your visa expires, and we'll talk about those in a second. This next thing is there's one other grace period we need to talk about. So you have the 10-day grace period. That is, at the end of your visa status, you maintain legal status for your entire 3-year time period, and then you have that 10 days to tie up loose ends and leave the country. And again, really, you have 3 years and 10 days. And I'm going to say that, 3 years and 10 days, because you need to plan. You should plan. If you're not planning for immigration, you're not planning for the future, you're making a mistake with immigration. The second grace period is a 60-day grace period. Now, the 60-day grace period really applies to the question at hand. If you're staying your entire 3 years, you're not being laid off or fired. You knew your visa status is ending at that time. They chose not to extend your visa, right? Your employer didn't offer you another 3-year employment.
Yeah.
If, let's say, you've been working for the company for a year, you entered on November 2020, and now it's November 2021. You're a year in. You still have 2 years left on your visa. And your employer comes to you and says, you know what, Bob?
We're eliminating your position.
We no longer need you.
We have a robot to do your job.
And
a robot lawyer.
Your employment's terminated. Or let's say you've been working for Kraft for a year, and I don't know why I'm using Kraft. Don't get mad at Kraft. Know. You're a good employer.
Are you hungry?
I'm sure you're great. I'm sure they're a great employer. So I'm not saying anything about Kraft. Your employer says, or you say, you know what, I do not like working for this company, and you resign after a year. In any of those situations, if your employment for some reason terminates, it doesn't matter if you quit, it doesn't matter if you're fired, you resign, whatever it is. It could be, a fiery termination.
Could be for cause,
amicable,
without cause,
matter. If it ends,
any reason,
and you still have time left, because in this scenario, you're going to have 2 years left on your visa, right? Because you were a year in, you still have 2 more years left. You get a 60-day grace period instead of a 10-day grace period because you have that remaining chunk of time on your visa. Now, the 60-day grace period can't go beyond the end of your visa. So here, let's say you got terminated and you had a month left on your visa.
Point.
Well, you only get 30 days of the grace period. You don't get 60. It'll go for 60 days from the end of employment. So if that is at the very end of your visa and you only had a month left, well, you're going to still get 60-day grace period, but it's from the end of your employment, not the end of your visa at that point, if that makes sense. So you get a 60-day grace period. Now we'll get into what you can do. Let's say you're in the 10-day grace period or the 60-day grace period. The 10-day grace period means you used all of your visa allotment and you have 10 days to make up your mind on what to do. The 60-day grace period means your visa was, or your employment was terminated prior to the expiration of your visa.
In either case, the clock is ticking because now your stay in the United States has a definite end coming up.
And long-term consequences if you don't abide.
Right.
So there are typically 3 things that we recommend to people. One of them, and hopefully this is what happens, is you find a new employer, change of employer. And these options we're giving can, if you're Canadian, it's amazing because you have 2 options, right? You can file for these a new employer in the U.S., or you can simply leave and come back in if you're on a TN and apply at a port of entry, coming back in. So Canadians actually have more flexibility in doing this. But you can change your employer. We're assuming in this situation that you don't want to leave the U.S. So if you don't want to leave the U.S., you have 60 days to file for a change of employer with USCIS. And you do that through Form I-129. Your employer has to file to change you from your current employer to the new employer. So you have 60 days to file that change of employer application. That's one. The second one is you can file for what's called a change of status. In other words, let's say you entered on that TN visa, but you didn't find an employment and you don't know when you're going to find new employment. Well, you could file by mail with USCIS to change to a visitor or another status for that
without
matter.
leaving the country, you can stay in the United States, file that form, and ask USCIS to change you over.
From a TN to a B as a visitor.
Right. Again, discretionary, and they'll decide whether or not they want to allow you to do that, but
in most
make
cases,
the application.
They typically approve it. Why? And this is why. Is because it takes longer than, because usually they're going to give you a 6-month extension for a visitor visa, but it takes them longer than 6 months to adjudicate it. So by default, they typically give people at least 6 months.
Yeah, so these, and don't think that you can ask for a visitor status for 2 years or something like that.
6 years is usually the limit.
6 months.
Or 6 years. Don't ask for 2, ask for 6.
That's a way better deal.
6 months.
Yeah, 6 months is the limit. So even when you don't hear back from them after 6 months, what should you do? You got to leave, because
still leave.
If they're only going to give you 6 months, so, and you don't want to overstay and then, risk having some of these consequences. So even if you don't hear back, do a change of status and leave after the 6 months, even if you don't have any decision yet.
Yeah, and once you file, and as long as you file within that 60-day grace period, you're put into what's called an authorized period of stay. So you're allowed to remain in the United States while you wait for the adjudication of that application. Now, going back to change of employer, if you're on a TN and you file to change of employer and it's within the 60 days, you cannot start working for that new employer until it's approved. They won't let you. So that's important to understand. Just because you file for change of employer, you can't start working until that application is approved, which is why many people opt for what's called premium processing, so they can get their application approved speedily, so they can get to work again right away. Otherwise, you could be waiting several months for them to approve a change of employer application. And with that change of status from a TN to a B visa as a visitor, you can immediately commence being a visitor and sitting on your couch and doing whatever you want. Hopefully you're looking for a new job, and then when you find a new job, then you file a subsequent application to change from B visa back to TN or whatever that status might be. And it doesn't just apply to a visitor visa. If your spouse is an L visa holder, well, then you have a work authorization option immediately as a spouse of an L visa holder. But an H4, which would be the dependent of an H-1B visa holder, other visa statuses, even student visa statuses, if your spouse happens to be under another visa status, you can file to change from your TN to whatever dependent status would be attached to your spouse, if that's available too. So
we should also note here that spouses of the visa holder will lose their status as well. So if you are here on a TN and your spouse is here as a TD, that spouse is going to lose their status with you losing your status. It's not separate.
Yep. So any dependents are dependent on you maintaining.
Yeah, the
your
whole
status.
family loses status when it's all dependent upon one worker.
So you would have to file a change of status for every individual that is dependent on you if you do that.
And we saw people do that during COVID. They didn't want to travel because of the vaccination requirements and the uncertainty at the border. So plenty of people chose to file with USCIS to change their status. Whole families did, rather than take the risk of traveling.
Yep. So that would be one of the options, change of status to a different visa status that allows you to stay here as well. And then the last option, and sometimes it's the first option for people, is just depart the United States. That's the safest one. You have 60 days to tie up your loose ends and to leave. If you didn't find employment, if changing to a visitor doesn't fit your situation, then you would simply depart the United States once you tie up your loose ends. So those are generally the three options to stay in legal status: find a new employer, change to another status, or to depart the country within that grace period. Now, what are the consequences? What happens if, let's say,
if you ignore us today and just do what you want and stay in the United States,
and you overstay?
What happens?
Say my visa expired yesterday, and we're talking about the end of the visa. So my 3-year visa expired. Now my 10-day grace period expired. I haven't done anything yet, and I stay in the United States for 6 more
your
months
lease.
after that.
Yeah, your lease is good for another 6 months. So
So why leave? I paid through the year. I'm gonna use the rest of my lease. Otherwise I'm losing money.
yeah,
What
That's-
happens
a lot
if
of
I
people
overstay
think
by
that way.
6 months?
you're going to have an issue, sir. So, even if they don't come banging down your door to remove you from the United States, the next time you try to re-enter the United States is when this is going to all come to a head. The next time you try to come in, you are going to be slapped with a bar to entering the United States for overstay.
For how long?
For 3 years.
For 3 years. So if you overstay your visa by 6 to 12 months, 12 months another bar kicks in, but if it's between 6 to 12 months, you're going to get a 3-year bar on readmission to the United States. Now, if you're paying attention, the bar doesn't kick in until the 6-month mark, right?
Right.
So you technically could overstay your visa by 5 months and 29 days and still not get that 3-year bar attached. What you can't do if you do that, though, is file a change of status
or try to re-enter
employer.
the United States in a
quickly,
short period of time.
They will refuse you.
Yes.
But there is no long-term consequence until you hit that 6-month mark. There could be short-term consequences. They don't like it, and they will know what happened if you try to re-enter the U.S.
And it's so much fun when you're flagged at the border, isn't it? I mean, that's such a picnic. So
We do not advise that.
no.
So stay away from that. But it is important to understand if you do find yourself in that situation because you didn't know, and you overstayed that 10-day grace period or that 60-day grace period, and now you're in that extra 6-month cushion there before long-term consequence attaches, you do have until that 6-month mark to get out of here. And you better get out fast if you're listening and you're in that situation, you better leave. Better yet, hopefully you're in the 10-day or 60-day period and you take appropriate action so you don't ever even get to that point.
Yep. And there's a more serious consequence too. And we recently had someone email us an intake question about an overstay that they weren't working. I think they were possibly a retired person.
Oh yeah, down in, let's say, Florida. Oh, yeah.
But this person emailed us and they had overstayed inadvertently, according to them. COVID happened and they presumed the border was closed to them. We heard that a lot. During COVID, they thought the border was closed.
Which is not an excuse. So if you're listening and you say, "Oh, I couldn't travel because of COVID," you could have. You could have left back to your home country.
But this person was just a visitor. They didn't have any employment status, and they overstayed to the tune of a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, with apparently owned property and their work needed to be done on property, pets had health issues, things like that. And took no heed to the rules that, as a visitor, you have to leave after 6 months, and then left for a few days and tried to return to the United States shortly thereafter, and was hit with an even bigger bar than the 3-year bar. So
and what's that?
This person got a 10-year bar to entering the United States.
And the 10-year bar hits once you overstay by 6 months or by a year or more.
A year or more, yeah.
Once you hit that year mark,
Yep.
then it's a 10-year bar. So yeah, that's an unfortunate situation. And people find themselves in that situation quite often, more often than you would think. And because of what you just said, they may have a retirement home or something in the United States, and they just time
or they have a
flies.
health issue or something, and
or family or
Yep.
whatever it is, and they're overstaying. But 6 months is actually pretty easy if you live that kind of life. Maybe you're retired, time flies, right? And all of a sudden, I've been there. You overstayed by 6 months
yeah.
or a year.
And now you have long-term consequences.
So 6 months, 3-year bar. A year, a 10-year bar.
A year or more, yeah.
A year or more. So remember that. And there are other long-term immigration consequences depending on what you're doing here in the U.S., whether it's lawful or not. And we're not really going to get into those. But the purpose of this conversation is those grace periods, the 10-day and the 60-day grace period. Now, let's say you found yourself in that unfortunate situation where you did overstay. There are waivers available, and you can get a waiver for an overstay. So because you got a 10-year bar, doesn't mean you have to wait the entire 10 years to come back in. If you do wait 10 years, then you can come back in after 10 years, no problem. They're not going to question you. You served your time, right?
I recently did a green card for somebody who had
a 10-year overstay.
It wasn't a 10-year overstay, but it was definitely over a year. Had overstayed in the United States and then departed the United States and didn't try to return for 10 years. And then they applied for a green card. Yep. And it came up at the interview that they had, lived in the United States because they put down all their legitimate addresses in the U.S. while they lived here, and that they had no status during that time. But because 10 years had passed since then, they were not inadmissible to the United States, and the green card was approved.
And that brings up another point, honesty. When you're filling out your application, whether it's for a visa, a green card, whatever it is, this person that you're referring to could have lied about that. Could have said,
well, they didn't. They
knows.
wanted to lie about it. And they wanted to not disclose that information because they thought it would impact their ability to get the green card. And they said, nobody knows I was there. The 10 years has passed. I don't want to talk about it. I'm just going to put down that I was living somewhere else.
Yeah.
But
and then they find out, and then what happens?
Oh, yeah. Then that's misrepresentation. And then then your green card application is denied, and that's a bigger deal.
More issues.
Right. So we advised them to tell the truth. We figured out that it wasn't going to impact their ability to get it, and they were successful.
And fraud's a permanent bar, by the way. They say 5 years, but you always have to get a waiver for fraud. What if you get flagged for fraud and misrepresentation? Whereas an overstay, and you get the 3-year or the 10-year bar, well, those expire after either 3 or 10 years, and you don't have to get a waiver. However, if you're within the 3-year or 10-year time period, and this is what we see, is people were given a 3-year, 10-year bar, but now they need to work here, or now they need to do something else in the U.S. Well, if you want to do it before that bar expires, you need to get a waiver. You need to get permission to do it. And that just adds another layer of complication to the immigration process that you just don't want to mess with. So understanding these grace periods is very important. And we run into it a lot where people have overstayed in the past, or they lose employment and they want to change employers, or their employment situation or life situation.
I think knowing about that 10-day grace period is key, because we get a lot of calls from people that automatically assume they have a 60-day grace period.
No.
And they're already beyond their 10 days when they call us. So, they can't change status in the United States, and they're usually very frustrated by that because they insist they had a 60-day grace period.
Yeah, the 60
it's just
days
not true.
Only if your employment ends before your visa. Remember that. 10 days is all you get. If you stayed here the entire duration of your visa, you only get 10 days to take action. And this goes back to what I said before, and I said I was going to keep repeating it, is you need to be prepared, right? Don't procrastinate with immigration. It'll come back and bite you. So especially if you have long-term plans. If your plan is to eventually get sponsored by your employer for a green card, or maybe a family member sponsor you, or whatever it is, you don't want to taint your immigration record, because it can have long-term consequences.
It'll come up.
It will come up, and you have to answer to it. And being honest throughout the process is going to be in your favor in the long run, even if you did have a discretion in the past. The wind here is howling.
Yeah, I don't know if you can. It's really loud.
It's supposed to get up to 50 miles an hour, and we're at the top of our building, so it's really howling through the windows. So keep those grace periods in mind. And like you said, it's important to understand the difference between the 10-day and the 60-day grace period. You don't automatically get a 60-day grace period. So make sure you understand when each grace period applies and what your options are so you can take appropriate immigration action. Thank you for tuning in to the Arrive podcast today. Hopefully we are able to learn something new. If you have any other immigration questions or need assistance with immigration at all, we'd be glad to help you out. If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast for upcoming episodes and tune in next time. Thank you for listening and have a great day.